welcome to the latest edition of the DevRel Book Club. I'm Matthew and Ramón, and I am joined, as always, by my friend Ramón Huidobro. Hello, Ramón.
Hey, Matt. Hi, everybody. Hope everybody's having a wonderful day. If you're listening to this later on, hope you're having a wonderful day as well.
And today we are going to be joined by Erin Mikail Staples, who is a technical community builder, and will be discussing with us the book A City Is Not a Computer, which is a fascinating read. I've been working my way through it over the past couple of weeks, and I know you have as well, Ramón. It's something a little bit different compared to what we've covered in the previous episodes. Not only is it more of an academic text, but it's really taken to home the idea that this should be a series of reviews of books that aren't directly related to developer relations. And so I think it's going to be a really fascinating conversation with Erin, looking at how this does apply to her work as a technical community builder.
I was just gonna say, I was surprised reading it because I went in not having read much about it, and then I sort of came out realizing that I had read an academic text that wasn't just so much about computers or developer relations, but it was also quite anthropological. I could be wrong about that.
Now, this episode of the DevRel Book Club is sponsored by Orbit, and we have a quick message from them just before we get into the meat of the podcast.
I'm Patrick Woods. I'm co-founder and CEO of Orbit. Orbit is the community growth platform that allows more than 9,000 users manage more than 30 million community members across their platforms. Almost everyone we talked to early on, when they were thinking about measuring their community, they were using the funnel to describe and measure the community outcomes. It seems obvious because it's been the only commercial metaphor we've had. But because the funnel is measuring linear and binary processes, it starts to break down when you think about community. Because if you think about the communities you've been a part of, the way you engage in it, it's neither linear nor binary. And so everyone we spoke with was using this idea, this metaphor, to reason about their community. And it wasn't working. It was the goofy analogy I have is it's like trying to describe the smell of a sound. Like it's just different languages entirely. And so we realized that instead of pushing community members through a pre-prescribed set of steps, what you actually want to do is to create a community that's so attractive that it naturally pulls people into that community. We call that high gravity. And if you think about the visual identity of a funnel, looks like a sort of like an ice cream cone. When you think about your community, we actually think about concentric circles of an orbit sitting on top of that funnel. And the theory is that if you create more activity, create more engagement, increase the love of your community, as we would say in the orbit model, then that thing will get so much bigger on top, like an ice cream cone, such that more ice cream naturally drips down into the cone.
Well, thank you very much to Orbit for supporting us in this series. Okay, well, let's bring in Erin and get discussing this really fascinating title. So, Erin, welcome to the DevRel Book Club.
Hi, all. I'm super excited for this. I'm a super avid reader, and so this is actually probably one of the best books that I've read throughout the last year, and it is one of those recommendations that I'm like, I know it's a little academic, I know it can be dense, but it is also one that I think has so many applications for people, not just in developer relations and technical community building, but in people who give a crap about the communities that they live in and how they work. So yeah, because a little feel good in your world.
I think it's one of the most fascinating books we've looked at so far. And before we dive into the detail of it, I would love it if you could please kind of tell us about your journey so far as a technical community builder, and I guess a little bit about your philosophy when it comes to developer communities and developer relations, because I think that'll feed into helping people frame their understanding of why the book means so much to you.
Yeah. So for context, my journey into developer relations, developer education, insert DevRel adjacent title, technical community builder title here, was kind of an accident. I started very much learning by doing. I landed in this space because of an accident. I actually was a product manager before I made the pivot into this space. And it all came down to getting that job and being like, hey, we're hiring a head of community, also who needs to do product docs, also who needs to do documentation. Also, you're already running Twitch, so congrats, you're the new head of community, and you still need to be a product manager. And that was what I say is my accidental detour into this space. But throughout the last few years, I've really dove into more open source and really understanding what this space is. And I am intentionally sort of vague on titles right now because I think we're still figuring them out as a whole industry. I do think Mary Thengvall does a really good job of highlighting the 3 pillars of what DevRel is, and that's code, content, and community. And I think everybody has their natural strengths of where they lie on those things. But overall, my personal relations is how do we continue to build and advocate for the tools that we use, the companies that we work for, and also the industry as a whole as individuals. And I think that is very much through these roles that we see in developer relations.
Fascinating. I like this. I like this compartmentalization of the 3 pillars, and it's funny. A lot of folks that I talk to who are in DevRel, end up telling a story of how they kind of found themselves sort of wandering into it, and it's interesting. I see a lot of folks doing that, but I'm also seeing a lot of folks starting to now like focus on that from the very start of their career. It's a bit off topic, just it's great to see that there's such a diversity of entry there, because I really believe that in DevRel there's no set linear path for getting in.
There's no set linear path for getting in, and there's also no set linear path, and we're just starting to see that linear path of career development in many ways. So it is still very nascent. We don't have a progression of like what defines a senior level role or a junior level role or a staff level role. It is not common in how we've evolved these. Pay is not transparent and common. We don't have expectations of deliverables. I think right now I am on the quest for my next adventure of what I want to do for full-time work. But a question that I always kind of throw people at is like, are you interested in output? Are you interested in metrics? And what does success looks like with me as a hire on your team? And throwing it back on them, and like that really tells me as an individual, what does the company want out of this position? And hearing answers like growth or documentation, it's like really exciting to see. But continue, Matthew.
Well, I was going to say this is one of the topics that I'm thinking about an awful lot at the moment, which is we're working on a thing that we're calling the DevRel Industry Report, and one of the first sections of that report is going to be what is the mandate given to your team, because I think there's so much variety in DevRel, and we're getting way off topic, but I think so much variety in DevRel that actually the things that different DevRel teams do are so wildly different that it can become very difficult for someone, particularly seeking their first DevRel job, to understand the context within which they would be working and to understand what that would mean for them as an individual working there. Yeah.
Great tangent, because that's actually one of the things I love about this book is it actually highlights, yes, we're talking about metrics that happen in cities and how cities have been developed throughout history. But the one thing that the book does tie across is like the metrics that we tried to measure what makes a good city. And it even highlights some of the problems that we see when we put certain metrics or we try to innovate for innovation's sake. And I think that is something I've really taken away to my day job of like, how can metrics impact the work that you're doing and the goals, and how are you executing?
Let's take a step back just momentarily and just talk about the context of this book, because this isn't a tech book. It's not in the sense that perhaps many of us would understand it. It's certainly not a DevRel book, but it's very much a community book in terms of physical community. But let's just talk briefly about the title. A city is not a computer, other urban intelligences. Now, a lot of people might look at that title and say, well, no, a city is not a computer. What are you talking about? It goes back to this idea, as from reading this, and you correct me, but as I understand it, that there's the idea of an organic city that is what Shannon describes as a semi-lattice. So it kind of builds up and it's overlapping and kind of looks a bit chaotic, but it works. And then there's this idea of a city as a tree, which seems to go back into urban planning a long way, which is where you see cities like the planned cities like Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, where it's meant to function like the veins of an organism. But actually, what's coming out now is an idea that with smart cities, if we can get as much information about a city as possible, then we can solve all its issues. And I guess the central thesis of the book is, well, not so much. Would that be fair?
Definitely say that's fair. There's also the idea, this is kind of, jumped off of, there is the book, A Computer is Not a Tree, which is kind of like, talks about like how there's very structured and organized and thought out ways of thinking, but we give certain binaries to what we think about when we think about development or innovation. Like it's either innovative or not. Like it's like it is or it isn't. It's good or it's bad. We apply a lot of binaries to situations that don't have binaries. Like I always joke that like people are like, what makes a successful community? And you're like, well, it depends. Or what makes a great DevRel? And it's like, well, your first answer is it depends. But when you think of cities on a map, you often think of like those lists that are like top 10 most popular cities or top 10 fastest growing cities or top 10 cities best for children. But who is writing those lists and by what metrics are they judging them? And how are we continuing to leverage them? And where are we creating binaries where we probably shouldn't be creating binaries in these situations? And I think that's something that I really pull away from and can start to think about, like even in the quest for the world of developer relations and community building. And as this industry only continues to grow, where are we forcing our own binaries in extreme growth? And where might they be hurting us?
Now, sorry, Ramon, I can see you're about to say something. I'll let you go.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to also contextualize it a little bit because one thing that I was telling both of you before we started this that kept surprising me as I read this is, wow, this book came out last year, and what a difference it makes to think about, how computers affect society, not just in the last 2 years, having just gone through a global pandemic, having been going through a global pandemic, but also how a lot of the things that we took for granted in terms of what a smart city should be, how computers enhance our lives has been taken for granted into that account. And that's something I found really surprising. And in fact, it reminded me of so I don't have a bachelor's degree, but I did do a lot of courses. And one of them was Basics of Human-Computer Interaction. And that was a course that I found really compelling. And I feel like this book would have fit really well in there in terms of like the ethics, the social justice side of computing in general and community. And would it be fair to assume, Erin, that this is a lot of what's in, I'm curious how it's affected you because it only came out last year. Since then.
So I picked this up. It was in another list. I'd been following the author on Twitter. I picked this up. I really like this idea of, I'm always kind of a forever learner. My library list is a little extremely nonfiction oriented. And I have always wondered, like, I love how do we determine innovation and how do we determine success? And one of the things that I really like is the author Shannon really highlights that technology itself inherently is not bad. Like there's lots of conveniences. Okay, Netflix, can we say Westworld on my HBO watching life? There are lots of benefits we get from technology. However, when is too much and how did we get here? Like the historical context, I think provides so much information. And even those little details, that's what I really look towards a lot. Because I will be the first to admit I can get excited about a shiny new thing, or I want to test out the latest and greatest. I love the next new thing. I love playing in this very tech savvy world, but when might not that be the most effective or realistic scenario? And what hidden impacts am I contributing to because of that situation? And what of these latest also have to tie in with privilege as well? Like, What impacts am I surfacing from a privileged perspective, being a white cis-presenting female, to the larger world?
Sorry, I was gonna say, like, this is something that really impressed me about it too, because it was jam packed. I felt like so much of what I was reading was sort of hitting me at once, and sort of like nodding along furiously with what I was reading. It was deeply impactful. I was really astounded by how this book. I mean, I'm gonna have to read it again. Is what I wanted to say.
The main takeaway I had from this book was that we as humans start to think that we're very clever, and we mistake instrumentation for the truth. In communities, we are very quick to think that if we create a strategy, create a purpose, and then instrument it so that we've got lots of measurements and metrics going on, then, well, we're the controllers of this mini universe that we've created. And actually what we're doing is we're always going to be somewhat blinkered, because we are frail humans. We can't see everything. We can't know everything. We can't predict everything. And we, in community, we build these plans and these incentives and so on. And then we realize that actually we're gamifying people out of our community, because that's not what they came for. They didn't come to win an iPad. They came to satisfy some kind of internal need.
That's a huge point that I like. There's two things that I think really I tile into, is like kind of on the two buckets of if I had to classify major takeaways. And it's like, one, this idea, and I wrote down a couple quotes, like she writes early on in the book, today's talismans manifest not as rings or stones, but as glowing screens, and talks about this idea of having the perfect city dashboard. And it's like, the city dashboard will be one place you can look for all of your information. And we invested how much, like, in dashboards? And I mean, how much do we have? Like, I remember years ago, I was at an agency and we spent like 2 weeks building a gecko board. And it's like, not to say that that gecko board is wrong, or not to say that we should be completely blinded by it, but like, everything we got to take with a little bit grain of salt, because also your dashboard could be measuring the wrong things, or the data on your dashboard could be broken, or dashboards and metrics are determined by the people who set those metrics. And that is coming with a place of privilege and understanding and context. So we need to understand, there will probably be a point in all of our developer relations career. I've been there, I've done that. I am not fearful of metrics. And I think that's the attitude you need to take, is you can't be fearful, but you also have to be empathetic and human and be like, here's what I have found. Here are metrics and stories from people that I have heard. Here's how I can communicate metrics, but also the human side of it as well. So I think that's one big one, is what are we using as talismans, North Stars, dashboards, metrics, and so on and so forth. And the second part I really took away is, what is a place? And she asks this question later on in the book, and she talks about kind of the rise of the 2020 pandemic and what happened, and how things like libraries, which seems like a very physical place, went online. Like, how many people weren't using Libby like before the pandemic? And I think all my friends went from nobody using the Libby app, which is the free library app, to all of my friends using the library app, like within a matter of 6 months. Or how many times did we do virtual happy hours? Like, you would have never done that pre-pandemic. But she writes about this idea, and I quote, if density is a risk, if embodied sociality is expendable, and if culture is digitizable, what makes a city a city? And I think we need to intentionally think about, if we are working in a space of developer relations and communities, why are we gathering and what makes us different? And if we can't clearly put our finger on that, we need to reevaluate what we're doing.
It's extremely well put. Thank you. And it's funny. Like, it's funny because there was a whole section of the book dedicated to those libraries, and all I could think was, as I was reading it, is, gosh, I miss going to the library. Like, I know it wasn't the main point of it, but it was also kind of like there was a very effective romanticization of it that I felt like, oh gosh, I want to go back to one.
I walk by one every day and stop by and do work from one on a regular basis. So I will say I am a library nerd, but even to kind of dive into that fact, like, she even writes about, like, the point of a library is early on, and she quotes this other reference, that libraries all started with lecture halls. which I think is fascinating. Like we think of libraries and we think of books and we think of physical copies, or even now, like you can check out video games as a library. I learned this, like my colleague was doing that for his kids and stuff. And I just think that's like amazing that they've become these, but the original intentions and the original best practices, as I say, for a library was to have a lecture hall. And the journalism nerd in me, who came from journalism land and always thinks that there's one tenet and theory of journalism that says journalism's role in a society is to uphold conversation and spur conversations that facilitates ideas and truth telling. And if libraries were to have lecture halls, where is the lecture hall in your community? Or where are these places that we're creating for the spreading and sharing of knowledge?
Yeah, and I think that feeds into something I kind of have a little bit of a problem with, is that often when companies talk about having a community, what they mean is they've got a forum or a Discord, and that's kind of box ticked, that's done. One of the things I took away is the idea of humility. You got to be humble about your own role in this.
And we see it all the time. I always joke, I once worked somewhere that they put Facebook ads towards the Discord community because I was not doing my job good enough, and the big number and the number of people in there was not going up fast. I was like, but people are having conversations, and when we do have people join, they're immediately hyper engaged, and I would rather have someone come in and immediately be like, all right. And it was a very academic community. It was a lot of folks were worried about neurodiversity, and there was people literally studying for their PhD and like doing things well above my brain power, and literal neuroscientists having discussions over journal articles. And I'm like, this is amazing. And then we put Facebook ads in, and the quality of the community almost instantly tanked, and it killed it. And I remember my boss had made that decision, and I was just like, it was like, watching a train wreck where you're just like, cries.
And I think, I think most, if not all of us, have seen one example of this in one shape or form or another, and it's tremendously disappointing because it comes back to that sort of parable of, we want, at the end of the day, we want quality over quantity. Mm-hmm. And that sort of ties into one part that really stood out to me from the book, was towards the end, talking about the importance and responsibility around the maintainability of these efforts. Not just setting up something for the sake of setting it up, but also making sure it sticks around, as you were saying, Erin, about, making sure that the quality of the conversation stays there, but also making sure that folks are having those conversations by engaging with them, by being there when they're needed, because a community is in essence or meant to be organic in its growth and health. And our job as curators is to make sure that stays healthy. It posited towards the end how important it is not just for there to be a maintenance strategy, but also a maintenance of that maintenance strategy. And that really hit me hard because I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen through things that I've done. I'm guilty of coming in with lofty aspirations, of being like, oh, I'll move our community into Discord. It's going to be great. We're going to have game nights. We're going to, hang out and stuff.
All been there. We've all been there. Yeah. Relate.
Yeah. And it doesn't work out because, it doesn't work out, and that's fine. But you still think like next time going in, you're thinking like, all right, maybe let's dial it back a little bit and have a proper like check-in strategy. And that, to see it spelled out like that in a more in a wider anthropological sense was really astounding.
One thing that really reminded me of is like on this maintenance side is her focus on who owns that. Like, who owns this and who is dictating, which I think we don't discuss enough. And I think there's, Matthew, as like you mentioned earlier, you talked about like all these companies being like, created a Discord, check, created a forum, check, community, great. And it's like, or they're like, people are like, my community exists for sales enablement. I'm like, that's gross. Or whatever else it might be. But when you create communities like that, your cost of maintenance to some people appears to be a sunk cost because they cannot directly measure the impact of improving your community.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard. And I think we also have to understand what happens when we let these structures and these spaces devolve. Like, she writes a lot about like the rise in the 60s of this idea of social infrastructure. And in many ways, I don't know that we've maintained this. And in many ways, we went for, she talks a lot about the rise of software and comparing software to cities. And she writes about like, you can't have a move fast and break things in urban infrastructure, which like, also you can't really have move fast and break things in people either. Like, that's a really gross, icky, transactional way to think of things. Like, and if you do like, oh, you're not going to buy my product, get out. Like, how many people are you going to irritate? And that means that these spaces, even if they are created by a company, and I'm very explicitly saying, like, it's not that I'm not for companies hiring and building community teams. I'm very much in favor of that. However, your community team needs to be cross-functional inside your organization as well. Because if your organization doesn't care about their external community, you're setting yourself up for failure.
And so that takes us on to then, how do we use what Shannon Mattern discusses in this book to make us better as community professionals? So I think that element of humility is important, and of understanding that actually just because you can measure something doesn't mean you have the truth. But to me, that I keep saying there was one key takeaway, but I'm coming up with more and more. Another thing that I really took away from this was the idea that value doesn't always come down to a number.
I think the two learnings I take away is it has to be organic. It has to be, people aren't like, you don't wake up in a day, you're not a robot. I surely don't wake up in even the right side of the bed every day. Let's be realistic. There's ebbs and flows to the human thing. The binaries part is really important to me. I think that chapter kind of smacked me in the face of like, as someone who, I am a math nerd, I love numbers. I love geeking out and making sure, and I want to, like, I'm such a self-competitive person. I, was a competitive swimmer growing up, and that was, you did good or bad based on the number that came up on the clock. That is a very definite binary, but where is the nuance in our own community metric? And like the last one is, how are we creating space for knowledge, for connection? And how does connection facilitate that knowledge transfer? So this whole metaphor of libraries is very fascinating to me, and like thinking of curated spaces as libraries, and even thinking about the fact that having a library in your neighborhood or accessible to you is a privilege itself. So having the data of a community is a privilege, and that needs to be maintained, kept, and honored. Like, what if you didn't have a librarian to sort any of the books and they just were in a giant pile? That would be terrible. That'd be a terrible experience. What about these ideas of, sure, library is great, but like, we're all here discussing a book. How else can we discuss ideas? And what are the long-term impacts of us discussing those ideas? And that's kind of where my brain really fascinates, is like, throughout the binaries, get talking more about ideas. Ramón, I would be curious, like, did you have how are you going to take this book back?
Well, like I said previously, I want to read it again, because I think it's gonna, for real, it's going to be something that I'm going to need to process, because it just impacted me in several ways. And it's funny, I kept bringing up, there is one thing that particularly stood out to me. I was mentioning it earlier. As I was reading it, towards the end, it brought up a conversation that the author had with Nadia Eghbal, who wrote Working in Public. The book Working in Public, what was the full title? Oh gosh, I should have Googled this before coming on the podcast.
Actually, I have the book in my pile of things right here. I'm like, the Working in Public, the making and maintenance of open source software.
Thank you. And bringing up that book and talking about how open source maintain, like in a city is not a computer. She mentions that Nadia found out in her research that open source maintainers are oftentimes overstretched and tired, how that came kind of like screaming back at the point that this book is trying to make about humility, about responsibility, about not just doing things for the sake of doing them because we've done so in the past, doing them because it's modern. It's like we said, like it's modern, it's bright and shiny. Let's just keep pushing the envelope. That kind of brought it all screaming back, and it was incredible. That, by the way, I mentioned the book I mentioned, Work in Public, phenomenal read as well. Highly recommend it. Thank you.
It's another one that I have like plenty of sticky notes and annotation in. So yeah, both of these have my highlights and markups all over it.
Yeah, and thank you. And it's that. It's exactly that. It's having the humility to, because we've been pushing back on this idea that with code we can change and improve the world, which goes a little bit more into like software development than DevRel per se, but I think those two are related anyway. How the, for lack of a better term, the hubris of that is leading us astray sometimes. And I'm glad to see books like this pushing back at it from a perhaps not fully technical perspective, which again is humbling because it's like, yeah, the world doesn't revolve around the tech and the code we write. So that was really cool. It was a reminder to sit down and listen.
I like sit down and listen, I think is a very good takeaway for this book. I think we need to do more of that in our community. And especially as DevRel, I'm sorry, we probably are all a bunch of talkative, outgoing, spirited people that enjoy a good social chat, but maybe our role isn't doing that, and our role needs to be more sit down and listen. Are we actually providing what people want? Are we actually building spaces that people want to come? And how are we listening to what's not being said?
And then there's this thing, though, of one way of thinking that you're listening is to measure everything and to have a neat description of it. So it kind of comes back to the beginning of the book about City Dashboard, the first chapter, where, you're kind of given this false impression that if you have all of the data at your fingertips then that is a replacement for understanding or leads to understanding. And I think one of the part of that listening piece is actually just actually listening, not replacing human contact with numbers. And so I think I want to be clear. I think measurements, metrics, numbers are important, and they absolutely have a role to play, and they're essential to reporting up and to explaining your work, and also a really good role in helping you to a DevRel team to improve on what they're doing. But just as a mayor can sit in an air-conditioned room and look at numbers on a screen, or otherwise go out and actually shake hands with people and talk to them and learn about their lives, then our role as developer community builders is really to make contact with the human beings who are in our communities, rather than just thinking of them as a set of numbers.
So that reminds me, and I mentioned this on a call or a Twitch stream yesterday, and one of the things that I use is like a personal metric of success, which is like interesting. We're saying no metrics, but what is your personal metrics? And as I've taken this pivot from product management into community and DevRel, and I've been here for 4 years, so it's not really like a new pivot in my world this time, but as I've really started to do that, one personal metric I have is how many friends do I make along this journey, and how could I get to keep collaborating with them from company to company to company to company. And like tomorrow, I'm hosting a Twitch stream with a friend of mine that we met on my very, very first community job, and both realized we love maker things. And now we like chat about cool IoT things on random basis. But my relationship, that was a personal metric win for me, because I know that I can build this ongoing relationship, which to me is really cool. And we don't talk about, that's not an easy to measure metric, or necessarily one that businesses get as excited about.
I love that because at the end of the day, it kind of speaks to how important it is to reframe those priorities, how important it is to re-examine those goals, not just as people, but not just as startups or companies or departments, but as society, as a community, as a society, it is to do so. And it reminds me of a point that was made towards the end of the book where it talked about Hudson Avenue, and
Hudson
bad at these
Yards?
terms. Hudson
Hudson
Yards,
Yards, yeah.
right? You can tell I've never been there. And how it was designed in a specific way, but then circumstances came along that meant they weren't used in exactly the way that it was meant. That it wasn't used in the way it was designed to be used, and how life just moved on around it. And that to me was a powerful image of needing to just think, hey, just because we designed a certain, it's kind of like software, or any kind of device really, or any kind of tool we have where we design it in a specific way, but then they end up being used in different ways.
Look, Erin, it's been amazing talking through, scratching the surface of this book. And I want to say, look how thick it is. It's about 180 pages, but it's got like 500 pages worth of content. So we couldn't do it justice in 45 minutes, but I think we have hopefully given people a taster of the book, and I would highly recommend that people buy it for themselves. Erin, you mentioned that you're doing like a Twitch stream tomorrow and so on. Mm-hmm. Where can people find you online and just generally?
Yeah, I'm at Erin Mikail on probably absolutely every platform there is. And I try to post all of my events at erin.events. So I'll be there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Erin. This was wonderful, and it was an absolute joy.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited that I got to geek out on this one with y'all, because this is truly one of my favorite books to geek out about, probably that came out in the last year or two. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.